Good morning, everyone. Beautiful morning here in sunny Florida, and we're continuing our master class on structure fishing. And we started by discussing way back in the beginning that there were 17 different types of structure. We had to identify them and talk about how to fish them and so on and so forth. And we've been through bars, we've been through all of the different types of humps. And the last time we got together, we started our discussion on man-made structure. And we mentioned there are dams and causeways and breakwaters and wing dams and underwater railroad grades, underwater roadbeds. There's a bunch of man-made structures. And with the exception of the breakwaters and the wing dams, they all take place, or they're all found, in man-made reservoirs. And when you look at causeways and dams, they're about the same as far as how you approach them and how you fish them. But more importantly, they were a couple of the man-made structures that you could just look and see. You didn't need a depth sounder, you didn't need a topo map, all you needed was your eyes, and you could see these structures. And that was one of the most important things that I could have told you the other day, was that when you're going to some of these reservoirs, these man-made reservoirs, especially flatlands and some lowlands, a lot of times it's a little difficult for new fishermen to identify structure. And the beautiful thing about those two structures is you can see them. You can go right to them and start fishing. But today, we're going to talk about underwater roadbeds. And I can include in that discussion underwater railroad grades and levees. So from this point forward, when I refer to an underwater roadbed, you could interchange that with a levee or with an underwater railroad grade. They're pretty much the same. They pretty much look the same. The fish use them the same way, and we fish them exactly the same. What makes them so good is if you begin to interpret structure. The most important thing, we've brought this out 27 times already, I'm sure. It must lead all the way. Well, these underwater roadbeds, for the most part, there's an exception, and I'll deal with that later. But in most all cases, these underwater roadbeds cross over the lake, and at some point they intersect with the main river channel. And as you know, in our discussion on deep water is a home of the fish, when you come to a man-made reservoir, it's simple. The channel, the old river channel, is the home of the fish. So we have these roadbeds that go across and intersect with that channel. So we know that they lead all the way. Now, what happened before the reservoir was flooded? These roads that existed, when it came across the river channel, there was a bridge. Well, the Corps came in and of course they blew up, they dynamited these bridges. This is a normal procedure. They cleaned it all out. So all was left was the abutment to that bridge on both sides. So as the reservoir is flooded, what we have here is this road that leads out, and all of a sudden when it hits that old river channel, it just breaks into the channel. There's no longer a bridge there, it's gone. And then it does the exact same thing on the other side. You have the abutment, and then the road leads clean up to the shallows, right up to the bank. So when you look at a roadbed, you look at that diagram, listen to what I'm telling you now, these roadbeds are the perfect structure. So as we're listing our 17 different types of structure, we list underwater roadbed, underwater railroad grade, levees, but we can link that all into one. It's just, they're all the same. And they're terrific structures. They are, in fact, a perfect structure. Now, as I look back over my entire career and all the promotions that we did and trying to develop the interest in, the interest in the local area, so that we could fill up the clinics and those kinds of things, we had to produce. Just like Buck did in his first 30 years, he used to say all the time, I just had to produce. I couldn't just tell people how it was. They wouldn't believe me. because most of what we tell people is a little bit different than what had been sort of talked about and understood in this game for years and years and years and years. So all of a sudden we come with a little something different. We're not fishing shallow, we're fishing deep. We're not fishing real slow, we're fishing fast most of the time. Almost everything we talked about was a little bit different than what was thought to be the truth for all of those years. So when we came to a new area and tried to tell them the truth about what a fish will do, where he spends most of his time, et cetera, and how to be more successful, how to catch them. Just saying it wasn't enough. They wouldn't believe you. You had to go prove it. And as I brought this up before, I could go out and prove it on their lake. But if no one knew that I did, or if I just said that I proved it and caught all these fish on their lake, they wouldn't believe that either. After all, I was a stranger. So I knew I had to take a local person, somebody that had some power, on a fishing trip out to their lake. Sometimes I took sports guys that happened to live in the area, well-known professional athletes. Sometimes I took the tackle dealers that had been established there for years. Other times I would take sports writers. Sports writers were my favorite because I knew that if I could perform with them and if I could get them catching fish, doing what I said we need to do, they were going to give me a write-up in the outdoor column, and that normally would fill the halls. So I'm going to give you an example of a roadbed that I fished in Texas, and I'm going to tell you exactly how this came about. I was doing one of those promotions. We had scheduled a clinic for Dallas and also one for Fort Worth. So it was a big sort of idea of doing a couple of big clinics in two major cities, but on promoting just one lake. And the lake I chose to promote was Grapevine. It's a man-made reservoir, Flatland Reservoir, just outside Dallas. And so as I normally would do, I walked into the Dallas newspaper. I met the outdoor writer, and we got to talking. And at first, he didn't seem to be too receptive to me as far as going fishing with me and so on and so forth, until I made my very famous statement. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do, my friend. You take me to a reservoir. It doesn't have to be Grapevine. You take me to any reservoir you choose. And within 1 hour, I guarantee you, we'll be catching big fish. And he thought for a minute, like most of them used to do, and he just could not accept that because he didn't believe it was possible. He didn't believe anybody could make that statement, and I went on to tell him that fish were very predictable, and that's the reason I feel very confident. He could pick a lake, we'll go catch fish, I promise. So he was the one who picked Grapevine. He said, how about Grapevine? It's not too far out of town. He said, a lot of people fish it, and I know there's fish in there, but you're going to have to show me what you can do. We'll go fishing. I said, okay, Grapevine it is. I had never fished Grapevine. I've been to Texas before, but I fished Sam Rayburn. I loved that lake. I fished a few other smaller lakes, but I hadn't fished Grapevine. So of course I went and got me a contour map right away, which again is my normal procedure. We were meeting the following day, or I think it was 2 days later we were to meet and go fishing. Well, I studied that map and I knew exactly what I was going to do. It was a Flatland Reservoir. I had my keys being man-made structure. And on the morning that we met, I picked him up, we grabbed a coffee, and we were heading over to Grapevine. And as we were driving, I mean, my truck started blowing in the wind. I'm towing my boat, and it was windy. It was windy, and it's first thing in the morning. It's early, and the wind's blowing. And as you know, if you ever been to Texas or anywhere else, if the wind's blowing at daybreak, you're in trouble. It's going to be a windy day. So we get down there, and I looked at the dam. That was going to be one of my keys to fish the riprap at the dam on Grapevine. There were 4-foot waves just crashing into that dam. Just pow, pow, pow. 4 foot. And a flatland reservoir, these shallower flatland reservoirs where there's shallow flats, when it blows, it's rough. If any of y'all been fishing that kind of water, you know what I'm talking about. It was rough. So I knew right then I couldn't get to the spots. I had circles all over that map. I knew exactly where I was going to go, what I was going to do. I had it all mapped out. Well, there's no way I could do that with that wind. In fact, there was no way we were going to be fishing grapevine that day, period. Didn't matter about what structures. We just weren't going to be able to be on that lake. So we sat there finishing our coffee, and I knew that this was a time thing with this guy. I couldn't get him back again. This was my opportunity, but yet we couldn't go out on that lake. So I took a shot, and I said to him, I said, listen, Bobby, I said, do you have any lake that you could point us to that may not be as big as this, may just be, sitting down in a valley somewhere, maybe some smaller lake or reservoir that we might go fish at? Since you've already made the day, took the day off and all of that, and made the effort, I'd like to at least get fishing somewhere. Is there any place you could think of that might fit that, where it would be a little less wind? He thought for a minute and he said, there is a spot. It's in Arlington. And I said, where's Arlington? He said, well, that's just a little area between Dallas and Fort Worth. So since you're doing 2 clinics, that would work for you if we could find some fish. He said, now, there's a little city reservoir over there. He said, it's not known for its bass fishing. He said, but they did stock Florida bass into this little reservoir years ago. I think it was in the 50s, sometime in the 50s, he was telling me. Even I was a young kid in the 50s, but at any rate. He said, but nobody really catches many bass. Occasionally there's some fish caught. He said, but it's more of one of those little city reservoirs where guys maybe after work just to launch their boat and they catch a few. There's some white bass and I think there's some hybrid striper bass in there. They catch some of them. Not so much of a largemouth lake. He said, now that I think of it, and he said it's not very big. And he said it is kind of sitting sort of down in an area where we might be able to fish. And then he said, in fact, the more I think about it, that'd be a heck of a place for you to try to prove to me that you can find. You said take you to any reservoir and you'd be catching big fish within the first hour. I think this would be a pretty good test. Well, to be honest with you, the way he described it, I wasn't really in favor of this. It didn't sound too good to me. But at any rate, I knew that if I could just maybe get him a few fish, that with the bad weather and all of that, he'd still give me a decent write-up. I'd rather do that than just send the guy home. So I said, okay, take me to it. I said, what's the name of this lake? He said, the name of the lake is Lake Arlington. And then he went on to describe to me that, and I'm a baseball guy, by the way, he said, that's where the Rangers play. The stadium is right there. He said, you'll be looking right at Arlington Stadium. Now, I know they're playing in the new ball yard now, but back then, it was Arlington. And so we drive down to this place, and as he's driving down to the ramp, we're going down a hill. So it was sort of nestled down a little bit out of the way. I already assumed, because it was Texas, it's probably a little flatland reservoir, probably a flatland. And again, my keys to fishing flatland reservoir, man-made structure. So I figured, well, if it's got a little causeway or something, I'll fish that, just like the last thing we talked about the other day. Or if it doesn't, I'll go down to the dam area, catch this guy a few bass, and then we'll be good. That'll be that. So we get down there, and I'm looking around. It's just a little pond. Obviously, I noticed real quick I could see the whole lake. There was no causeway. So I figured, well, I just run him down to the dam, and I'll catch him a few bass, hopefully. And then I'll probably get some sort of write-up, and I will talk about the horrible condition and all of that. But I knew I had to catch him some fish. And if there were bass in the lake, which he said there were. He said they had stocked it with Florida bass years ago. I said, so I know I could probably get him a few bass. So off we went. Launched the boat, get him in the boat. And I explained to him about my trolling equipment. I said, when I'm looking at a new lake, I'm doing a lot of trolling first. and then end up going to the cast once I locate the fish. So he didn't have any of that gear, so I had a trolling rod ready to go for him. So I'm looking down, I see where the dam is. The dam wasn't very wide. Wasn't my normal man-made structure at a flatland. But as we launched the boat and we started out into that little lake, up the lake just a little bit to the left, not too far from the ramp, it looked to me, as I looked at the wooded area at the entrance to the water, it looked as though there was an opening there. And this is a good lesson. And I never forgot it. This was back in the 70s. Never forgot it. Observation of terrain can give you a lot of answers to any lake, and for a lot of different reasons, any reservoir, for a lot of different ways, that observation of terrain can help you out. Remember we talked about the saddles, where that the land mass shrunk down to next to nothing, where all of that water of Lake of the Woods come pouring through there. I got that whole thing, it's not even on the map, I got it from my observation of terrain. Now, back to my story. I see this little bit of a break. I thought, before I go to the dam, I'm going to run up there and see maybe if we have a roadbed or a railroad grade, something that's breaking through that little wooded area there. So we go up, I turn left. Remember, went up a little bit, and on the way up, I swung out into the middle of the lake. I wanted to cross over the channel to sort of establish how much water we had in the channel. Because, you know, if I don't have deep water, I'm not a happy camper. So I established a channel, and as I recall, it was about 50 feet. I know there was 45 for sure, but I think there was about 50 feet in the channel. So I turned back around, meandered up there until I got straight across, first on the left-hand side bank, the same side as the ramp. I looked over, and I could see it plain as day. Here was a wide opening in the woods, little wooded area, wide opening. And here was this road coming right down to the water's edge. Oh boy. I got on that road, and I looked dead across, straight across the lake, and it wasn't very wide. So I said, okay, I got a roadbed. I turned my boat, got my depth sounder working, and got up on top of that road, and just with a sighting across the lake, I just followed that road out till it broke into the channel. Don't hold me to it, but it was about 17 feet where it actually broke into that old channel. And about 45 feet of water in the channel. Perfect. Now, here's where I want you to get a picture of this. When that reservoir was flooded, they dynamited where the bridge was, and now all that's left is this abutment that breaks into the channel. That's the contact point. Now, when fishing these roadbeds, I fish both sides. I have to establish which side. Most of the time, there'll be a predominant side. You catch fish both sides, but normally there'll be a predominant side. But the contact point, the four corners of those two abutments, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I made a pass this side, threw a marker. Made a pass when I came off the other side, threw a marker. I wanted to have that roadbed sitting in between two markers. I got two markers out here, and I got the road in the middle of it. And then I swung the boat around. We put on a 700 spoon plug. It's important you know that, because on a short line it goes 17 feet. I wanted to hit that end of that abutment at 17 feet on a trolling pass. And then I was going to troll it all the way back up to the shallows to establish whether there's any fish on it. We came around and made that first pass up there, and when our lures hit that abutment on the very first pass, pow! My rider friend hits a fish. And I could tell looking at his rod, it's a good fish. Sure enough, it's a big old bass, like 4.5, 5 pound fish. On the first pass, I keep the boat moving, get him to reel that in. Now, Let me make this point. I don't want you to ever forget this. When you hit a big fish, an adult-sized fish, we talk about all the time, all fish school together, and the older and bigger fish become, the more reluctant they are to go to the shallows, we know that, but also the tighter they will school. So when you catch a 4.5, 5.5 pound bass in deep water, and this was deep water, 17 feet, he's not alone. 99% of the time, he's not alone. So I knew, once he got the fish in, I took a real quick picture of it, and I said, now, we could go around and make another trolling pass come up here, but I explained to him what I just told you. Most of the time, when you hit a fish like that, he's not alone. So I said, we have a perfect anchoring position here. I said, we can anchor, which is what I'm going to do. I anchored the boat. We were in about 7 feet of water. And with a long cast, we could hit that channel. And I gave him a 100 spoon plug. And I said, we're going to be casting this. Now, I know you've never seen anything that looks like this, but it's a crankbait. I said, but what makes it different than all the others from a proper casting position like we have, we can throw that lure out there, sink it down in that channel. And then when we pick up and give it a little jerk and start cranking it, I said, the lure will stay on the bottom all the way back to the boat. It's going to come up over that contact point out there at the end of that roadbed. It's going to hit that spot, and then it'll stay on the bottom all the way back to where we're sitting. And I said, that's what we're going to accomplish right now. We're going to be casting, hopefully, to a school of fish. Let's see if there's any more out there. And the first cast I made, I showed them how to sink it down. And as I started reeling up, bang, same size fish, 4.5, 5 pound fish, big fish. I caught him, and he's all excited now. He's really excited. I got 2 markers sitting out there. All we got to do is cast in between those markers. I now know there's a school of fish sitting on this roadbed. This is perfect. It couldn't be any better. I'm elated. But at the same time, I know we got to get the lures out there. We got to keep them coming. And this is how you make big catches. Well, when he tried to throw that spoon plug, I think it's because the tendencies today, there's been a lot of people since since somebody invented the spinning tackle, of making a cast with your wrist. And when you do that with a spoon plug, it tumbles the lure and the multiple hooks catch up and you lose your cast. You have to make a cast with a bait caster, and the proper cast is a fulcrum, where it's like pounding a nail. You can do it with your wrist or you can do it with a fulcrum. Where do you get the most power? Fulcrum. So I was trying to teach him, you got to do this, and then that lure will sail out there, and then when it hits the water, you immediately thumb down on that reel and sink that lure. And as long as your hooks you don't tumble the lure and the hooks don't get hung up, you've got a good cast. You just have to make sure it hits the bottom before you start reeling. So he's trying real hard to make a cast. In the meantime, I make another cast. Boom! 3rd fish. Finally, I realized he's not going to make it. He's not going to be able to cast that spoon plug as far as I was throwing it. So I didn't want to do it, but I picked up the anchor real quick and moved it out and anchored down again about 7, 8, 10 feet closer. So now we're sitting in 9 feet, but it's still a good casting position. And he was closer to those 2 markers. So, and he finally got the hang of it, and the first time he sunk that lure down and brought it up over that abutment, bang, another fish. I'm not even believing myself. We came to this spot because of the bad weather and everything else, don't know a thing about the lake, and within just a few minutes, just by observation of terrain, we're sitting on a school of fish. And they're there at the same time we arrived. That's when they arrived. It was unbelievable. That's the reason I've never forgot this particular deal. So we kept casting. And I'm telling you, those fish stayed there for 45 minutes. From the time we landed those first 3 or 4 fish, those fish were on that roadbed for 45 minutes solid. I don't think I missed maybe 2 casts. He missed a few casts, but we pretty much had a fish on for 45 minutes, nonstop. And that, at that time, that catch of fish, and by the time we were done, by the way, and I'll explain something else to you, but by the time we were done, that catch of fish stood at that time as the most fish I had ever caught from one casting position on one movement of fish. 38 bass. The two of us caught 38 bass, and even though he was struggling a little bit with his cast, he finally got, you know, those fish. Finally, he was determined he was going to reach those two markers out there because he wanted to catch more fish, and he ended up doing a pretty good job, I have to admit. But together, on that one movement of fish, we caught 38 bass. So how do you think that write-up went? I mean, if you would have told me something like that could have happened, we got blown off of, we can't go fish Grapevine. We just find some little city lake, couple of 1,000 acres. That's all the bigger it was. And just by a quick observation terrain, I see it looked like a little road maybe. Sure enough, it was there. And then having the fish move and be there at the same, and they couldn't have been there much longer than when we got there, because the movement lasted 45 minutes after we started catching them. So they had to arrived on that roadbed about the same time we arrived. It's almost like one of those deals where you say, that's too good to be true. But it was true, now, I can tell you. And I wanted to give you, this is more presentation lures, but I want to tell you now because I'm getting excited remembering it. I was telling him, when you have a school of fish like that, and this is the summertime, by the way, this is, you know, this is the summertime. The water was hot, we were hot, and the fish were hot. And here's the deal. I said, when you get a school of fish coming like that, you got to crank that lure basically as fast as you can crank it, because, and once you hit that fish, you got to get them in out of that school. And what happens, because bass, especially bass, they're so pugnacious, they're so competitive, that when you have them like that, you can keep them in a frenzy. You can keep those fish in a frenzy, but you can't spend 10 minutes playing a fish, letting them there in the school, because they're going to spook the school. So the idea is, when you hit a fish, you bring him in real quick, you get him in the boat, and then you're making another cast. Now, I can't tell you how many hundreds of times I was in that position by myself. And that's where you make your big catches. But when you have two guys in the boat, that's way better than one, because you can keep those fish coming. You can just keep them coming. And the longer they're sitting there, the more frenzy they're in. And they're competing against that lure. Every time you throw it out there, boom, they're all trying to get it. And when the smoke cleared, we had 38 fish. Unbelievable. I tried to remain calm, like, take my glasses. I tried to, like, pretend like, oh, well, it's what I do all the time. Now, I've been in that situation lots of times, but with the writer, at the right moment, under really what was a bad weather condition for it to happen, I was so elated, it was hard to not show it. I just said, well, you know, when you hit the school of fish, and we're preaching that all the time, fish school together. And they migrate once or twice on a normal day towards the shallows. And when they do, if you're sitting in the right spot, and these underwater roadbeds, which we were just fortunate enough to find here, when they're on there, man, you can make hay, as you saw today. And that was that. And when we left there, I swear it took him about 2 days to calm down. And it took me about that long too. After I was out of his sight, I was dancing around the car. I was doing all kind of nonsensical things, saying, man, this promotion is solid, on solid ground for sure. So we have two clinics, and the happening took place at Lake Arlington, which is right in between Fort Worth and Dallas. It was so perfect. It's easy to understand why I remember it so well and so vividly. So I see this article. In fact, I have a picture. It's an old picture, but take a look at it, you'll get the idea. That picture hit the paper in the outdoor column, and on Friday night in Dallas, Texas, we had 1,300 people show up for that clinic. At the time, that was the biggest crowd I'd ever spoken to. And then the following night, we go over to Fort Worth, and we figured all the Fort Worth people were probably at the Dallas show. But we were surprised. The Fort Worth, I think there was 950, something like that, close to 1,000 people in Fort Worth. 2 nights in a row, 1,300, let's call it 1,000, 2,300 people wanted to find out what that was all about at Lake Arlington, down by the ballpark, in this little 2,000-acre reservoir, catching all these big old fish. And the whole key was an underwater roadbed. And I never have forgotten that one, obviously. So when I look at a reservoir map, the first thing I'm normally looking for is one of those underwater roadbeds. I love them. They're the perfect structure. Perfect. They got it all. And I'm going to talk more in detail a little bit later on in exactly how we fish these structures on a regular basis. The best way of fishing them once you locate them. I want to point something out before we leave here. I made a mention of that at the time, that was the most fish, most bass I'd ever caught from one casting position on one movement of fish. And 40 years later, that's still my all-time record, 38 bass, one casting position, and one migration of fish. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I appreciate it. See you next time.